is a recent book which has been made into a movie, which I have not yet seen. It's called Heaven is for Real. Some of you may be familiar with it. It tells the story of a little boy's near-death experience. Little Colton and his family, who lived in the southern United States, went on a trip to another state. And while they were away, the little boy started to get sick. And at first, no treatment was sought. And he started to get a little bit worse and a little bit worse, and so the family decided, well, really, we better go home and see a doctor. And by the time they got home, he was really sick, and it turns out that his appendix had burst. And for a few days, the poison had been infecting his body. And little Colton fell into a deep coma. And the story details the accounts of his near-death experience. For instance, after he came out of a coma and got better, he was able to talk about things that had happened while he was in a coma, things that had been discussed in the hospital, for example. And one reviewer of the book said that this story could be included among the works that make up the New Testament. Now, I have never had a near-death experience, and I don't want to have one. I reserve judgment on what our eyes may see when we die. But I do want to say that if not in content, then certainly in emphasis, the story of the little boy and of others who have had near-death experiences are different from what we find in the New Testament and throughout the history of the Christian tradition as Christians have read and tried to make sense of the Bible. What we find in the New Testament and what we find in the thoughts of Christians throughout the centuries is something we might call the Christian hope. And the question is for each of us, what is the Christian hope? And I think we might say a number of things about it. For one thing, the Christian hope is this worldly. The Christian hope is not for our escape from this world, but rather for the redemption and transformation of our world. The book of Revelation comes at the very end of the Bible. It describes the vision of a man called John of Patmos, a vision he had of God bringing to consummation and climax the story of human history. And at the very end of the book of Revelation, from which Ed read for us so well a few minutes ago, we find the very conclusion of that consummation. And what we find is a visual description of something called the Holy City, the New Jerusalem, coming from heaven to earth. We find heaven coming to earth. We find John of Patmos describing this visual experience of the Holy City, which features streets and other kinds of infrastructure. Now, while we don't want to take this visual experience in too literal a way, I do think it points us to the promise that God will transform and redeem our world. And therefore, our hope is not for an escape from creation, but rather for God's renewal of the creation we now experience. I think that's why, for instance, Jesus taught his followers to pray, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." Maybe you've heard the one about the minister and the cab driver who came to the pearly gates. Who were they greeted by? Of course, it was St. Peter. The cab driver was first in line, and St. Peter looked him up and down and knew instantly who he was, and draped around him a silk robe and gave him a gold staff. The cab driver was delighted. He moved thankfully through the pearly gates and into the kingdom of heaven. Next in line was the minister. St. Peter looked him up and down, knew instantly who he was, and he gave him a cotton robe and a wooden staff. Now, where the cab driver had been delighted, the minister was a little disappointed. He said, "St. Peter, I was a minister of the gospel for 40 years. I don't understand why this cab driver has been given such royal treatment, and here I am in a cotton robe and merely a wooden staff." And St. Peter said, "Well, here we've been very thankful for your efforts and your service, but this is heaven, and at the end of the day, we're into results. When you worked, people slept. When he worked, people prayed." There's a lot of good jokes about people coming to the pearly gates. If you look up on the internet, you can have a good laugh. I found, unfortunately, most of them were not appropriate for a sermon. But where do we imagine the pearly gates? We imagine them sitting on top of the clouds. If you do an internet search of the pearly gates and look up the images, 100% of the time you will see the pearly gates sitting on top of the clouds. That is so often how we imagine our hope. That of escaping the world as we experience it and going to live in the clouds while the angels are playing the harps. What the New Testament and the Christian tradition teach us is not to hope for an escape from the world, but rather for the transformation and renewal of the world. What's another thing we might say about the Christian hope? Another thing is that it is wonderful. John of Patmos envisioned the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven to earth, and of a river, a great, mighty, flowing river of the waters of life. And all around the river were the trees of life bearing fruit year-round. And John envisioned a place where he said there was no more curse. And curse is biblical code language for sin and death. There will be no more sin and death. And he said, there people will see God face to face. And there will be no more sun. But nonetheless, there will be no more nighttime. There will be no more need for lamps. For God will illuminate creation. God's presence will fill the world, and we will live in the absolute light of God's presence. It is something which is so wonderful. It is beyond our words to describe. It is beyond the ability of our minds to conceive. We can only hint at it in the slightest of ways. We had some family friends many years ago. They were the Burts. And Mrs. Burt was my mom's best friend. And for their summer vacation, the Burts had a trailer which they parked at a Christian campground. And one time we went to visit them there, and I'll never remember Mrs. Burt saying, and she was a very a devout, strong Christian person, and she said that she absolutely loved the campground. I mean, it was just perfect for her. And she said, if heaven was no better than this, I'd be okay. Now, hopefully, most of us have some experience of our lives that is all we could ever want. Maybe it's a place that we go or a thing we experience where we might be able to say, if this was all there was, I would be okay with this forever. I hope that is true, or has been true for all of us at some point in our lives. But we must not mistake the wonderful experiences we are sometimes able to enjoy with the wonder of being in God's presence. Sometimes we think it a comfort to imagine that our loved ones who have passed away are doing what they love up in heaven. Sometimes I hear the hope that someone who has died is now up in heaven and on the first tee with Grandpa and Uncle Fred. We must not mistake the things we now enjoy with the awesome wonder of being in the presence of God. Rather, I think we might look at our greatest experiences as being mere pointers and inadequate metaphors for the wonder of being in God's presence, even for a moment, let alone how wonderful it would be to see God face to face for eternity. Another thing we might say, I think, about the Christian hope is that it is both inclusive and exclusive. In the holy city, the New Jerusalem, this metaphorical way of understanding God's new creation, heaven come to earth, we hear descriptions of people of every nation, tribe, race, and clan filling the realm and experiencing God's presence. There are no human divisions among the community that makes up God's new creation. No divisions of skin color or age or gender or social class. For God's invitation is open to all. God has made every single one of us for relationship. And God wants to be in relationship with every human being, no matter who we are, where we live, or what we look like. And And yet, there is also an exclusivity. For many prefer to choose to be away from God. And I think God will honor that choice. And I think for us to honor that there is both divine and human freedom, we must see both an inclusivity and an exclusivity to God's promises. Interestingly enough, as much as the early Christians imagined a renewed and transformed Jerusalem as heaven, so they also imagined hell as being outside the city walls of the new and transformed Jerusalem. In the Hebrew and Greek languages in which the biblical books were originally written, the word for hell is actually the name of the Jerusalem garbage dump, which lay at the bottom of a low valley beyond the city walls. And there in new creation, may be those who prefer to choose not to be in God's presence. And if there is any such thing as eternal torment, as Christians have sometimes used the language, I think it is that torment of choosing to be apart from God. That gut-wrenching experience I know I've had, and perhaps you've had, of making the wrong decision, of doing something we knew was a mistake. Perhaps the last thing we might say about the Christian hope in the context of this conclusion to the book of Revelation is that it is motivating. The Christian hope is something which motivates us. On the one hand, it motivates us to seek reward. We want to live in such a way as God will reward us for our good and faithful lives. We want to enjoy a reward in the next life for what we have done in this one. But there's another way that it is motivating, and I think perhaps even a more important way. And that is to say that we as a people of God ought to be motivated to live in the present, according to how we think God's future will be. If we have a hope for the future, which is for a renewed creation, for a creation which reflects God's purposes perfectly, then we ought to want to live now according to what we have learned about those purposes from our glimpse of the future. In other words, we are motivated to act now according to what we think the future will be. This is what we do in many areas of our lives. For example, this is how we decide where to invest our savings. If we're fortunate enough to have some extra money to save for the future, we are likely to make decisions in the present about what we think the future reality will be. We're likely to buy an investment now if we think in the future it is likely to be more expensive, and therefore we can sell it at a profit. My parents bought the house they now live in 17 years before we bought the house we live in. My parents' house is much bigger than ours, and they bought it much cheaper. On the one hand, you might say it was foolish of us to buy a smaller house for more money. Except to say that it is more reasonable to think that in the long run, our house will be even more expensive in the future. And of course, there are always little ups and downs, but in the long run, it will probably be more expensive in the future than it is now. And so even though it seems very expensive and seems very foolish to borrow so much money to buy something, in the long run, we hope and think that it will pay off. We make decisions in the present about how we think future reality will be. Young people, if they think there is a new and upcoming career opportunity, will take training in the present to be prepared for what the future might be. And this is how our Christian hope motivates us. One of the great Christian theological books of the last 100 years is called The Moral Vision of the New Testament by Richard Hayes of Duke University in North Carolina. In reading the New Testament as carefully as can be, he has drawn out 3 ethical themes. One he calls the cross. We are to be faithful to God no matter what the consequences, as Jesus was. Another ethical theme is community. We are to think of our actions not only in terms of what we think is right personally for us, we are to think of our actions in terms of what builds up community, because God has made us to be a people. And the third and perhaps most important ethical theme he has identified, he calls new creation. God promises to renew and transform creation, and in fact, God has already begun to do so. We see it in the resurrection of Jesus. And he said Christians are to live in the present according to the promise of new creation, which has already begun. What is the Christian hope? What is it that Christians can hope for? I think much of what we hope for is frankly beyond our ability to describe or even imagine. We have only hints of what it will be like to have God's eternal promises fulfilled. What is the Christian hope? I think the best place we can look is in fact the story of Jesus' resurrection. It is that singular event in history which shows us most of all God's promises. It shows us of a God who is more powerful than even death. It shows us of a God who loves us and who wants to hold us in love in death and beyond. It shows us of a God who promises to renew and transform the created order, not do away with it. That is the place which shows us, yes, just a glimpse, but the best glimpse of what God's promises for us are and in what we can put our hope. The Anglican Book of Common Prayer uses a wonderful phrase in its liturgy. It talks of the sure and certain hope of the resurrection of the dead. The hope is sure. In other words, that is what the hope is. That is its content. As God raised Jesus, so one day God promises to raise us. It is sure, and it is also certain. Certain in that it will happen. Thanks and praise be to God. Amen. Our next hymn is printed actually on the blue-colored insert. I think it's on the inside. And just in case you are curious, this is my favorite hymn.